Today we are hosting the second program in our Legacies of 1619 series, which will explore Afro-Native connections. The next program will explore Black radicalism and will be held on November 16th at the Roxbury Community College. And the final program will be on December 14th and will explore citizenship and belonging, and that one will be here. For any of you who are here for the reception, I hope you noticed that we pulled together a small display case that was upstairs that had some really fascinating material that's relevant to this afternoon's discussion. It included, among other things, a debate about the fate of King Philip's son, who was a young child at the time. Peter Drummy put that together for us. Today we have a great panel, and I will introduce them in a moment, but before I do that, I would like to thank our co-sponsoring organizations, the Museum of African American History and the Roxbury Community College. So, moving on to our panel, today we'll hear from Christine DeLucia, who is an assistant professor of history at Williams College. She earned her PhD from Yale and did her undergraduate work at Harvard. She uses her scholarship and teaching to build stronger understanding of Indigenous peoples, past and present, and the complex relationships they have developed with place, heritage, and colonization. Her most recent book, Memory Lands, King Philip's War and the Place of Violence in the Northeast, was published by Yale University Press in 2018. It has received a number of awards, including the Berkshire Conference of Women's Historians, 2019 Book Award, an honorable mention for the National Council on Public History Book Award, and most importantly, the Peter Gomes Memorial Book Prize from the Massachusetts Historical Society. Professor DeLucia will be joined by Kendra Field, who is an associate professor of history and director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at Tufts University. She holds a PhD from New York University and is a graduate of Williams College and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. She is the recipient of numerous fellowships from institutions including the Ford Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Huntington Library, and the Charles Warren Center in American History at Harvard University. Yale University Press also released her recent book, Growing Up with Country, Family, Race, and Nation After the Civil War in 2018. She is also the co-director of the African American Trail Project, which maps African American public history sites and helps develop community-based public history projects across Greater Boston. She's also a member of the History, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Steering Committee at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And finally, our discussion today will be moderated by MHS's own president, Catherine Allgor. And I would like to point out that I'm ending exactly on time, so I'll now turn it over to Catherine.
And I want to thank the panelists for coming in, and I will echo Gavin's sentiment on such a beautiful day. We're really touched and honored that you joined us. To give you a sense of the program to come, I'm going to ask Christine DeLucia and Kendra Field to give presentations on their work, about 15 minutes or so. I've got a couple questions for them, and then we're going to open it up to you. We're very conscious of not trying your patience and your good spirit, so we'll try to keep to about an hour. Dr. DeLucia will begin the conversation with a discussion of the enslavement of Indigenous people going back to the beginning of the 17th century, the violence associated with this, and also the surprising fluidity these relationships had for some Native people, with some shifting in and out of slavery in a way that challenges our own preconceptions of what is slavery and who is an enslaved person. Professor Field will discuss how, through her family, she came to work at the intersection of Black and Native histories. She will also share a story from her book on the subject in the U.S. South and West. Finally, she'll talk about navigating this terrain in the context of education and public history here in Boston. Both Professor DeLucia and Professor Field will discuss how these histories have been passed down by Native American and African American communities and their own efforts to explore these narratives while respecting the authorship of the families in which these stories live. They will also speak on how this knowledge has existed within communities but has not been appreciated by wide audiences, at least not till recently. So please join with me in welcoming our panel today. Dr. DeLucia.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me all right? Thank you so much to Mass Historical Society for convening this. I thought it would be appropriate to begin with an acknowledgement of the traditional homelands where we are today. We are in Massachusetts native space, very near Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Ponkapog, and other communities, and it's important for us to acknowledge both the history and continuity of Native presence here in the Northeast. I wanted to dive right in by thinking with you about two pieces of public art that I think can shed light on some of the dimensions of Indigenous enslavement and also freedom in the Northeast. So the first of these is a mural that has recently gone up in downtown Providence, Rhode Island. I encourage you to go have a look at it if you're ever down there. It is showing a contemporary Narragansett tribal member who is holding a photograph. She is painted holding a photograph of Princess Redwing, a Pokanoket and Narragansett community member who for many years helped run a museum down in Narragansett and Niantic homelands. And this is a really powerful image to be looking at in an urban space. It vividly stresses to us that Native people are still here, that Narragansetts are still very much in their traditional homelands around Narragansett Bay, and perhaps even more important, that there have been long-term continuous processes of community knowledge keeping, of maintaining stories and understandings of the past within families, within communities, and sometimes even within tribal museums. We might juxtapose that mural with another piece of public art that is also in downtown Providence, and I hope you can see at least his head. This is a statue of Roger Williams, the early colonial founder of Rhode Island, who is often celebrated in Rhode Island state narratives, curriculum, monuments, as someone renowned for his tolerance, for religious pluralism, for his seemingly good relationships with Narragansett people and other Native communities. But the story is more complicated than that mythology. The document you see at left here, held at Rhode Island Historical Society, has Roger Williams' name affixed to it, along with the signatures of many other English colonists. They signed this document at the very end of King Philip's War around Narragansett Bay, and what they were doing was consigning Native prisoners of war into slavery. They were creating provisions for Native people who have been taken captive at the end of an enormously contentious resistance movement and sending them into bondage. And this is something that Roger Williams was very much a part of. It reflects a change in his own thinking and in his own practice. So how might we begin to grapple with histories in the Northeast of freedom, of enslavement, and of the complexity that both Native and colonial people navigated from the 17th century onward? Some of these histories I talk about in my recent book, Memory Lands, particularly the fourth part of it, which is titled The Red Atlantic. It traces the movements of Native people in far-flung parts of the Atlantic world. And in thinking about the event today, there are really three main threads that I would like to draw out for you today and also to handle some questions on. The first of these is that the violent seizure and enslavement of Indigenous people by European colonizers is foundational to this hemisphere's and also this region's history, yet it is often erased from mainstream narratives and mythologies. It is frequently not part of the story or only in a partial way. The second point is that Native families and communities have long been caretakers of important and also painful memories, stories, and records relating to their ancestors' experiences with enslavement and freedom. And I stress this because how to say this? There has been a tendency in some recent scholarship by non-Native scholars to portray it as if these histories are unknown or are just being discovered right now by academics. And that's a problem. It is erasing some extremely complicated and important practices that communities themselves have maintained. And I want to insist on this point because I am a non-Native scholar and I very much want to credit the people who have done much of this labor in carrying forward these difficult histories. The third of these points, I hope, will plant some seeds for your own interest and possible research. And this is that very local scales of research, meaning into specific families, households, and towns, is vital to recovering the complexities of Native people's movements into and out of bondage, and the often fluid spectrum of freedom and unfreedom that people experienced. And so I'll be sharing some specific examples of what this can look like at a quite local level. I'm going to move through a bit of terrain here quite fast, but to give you a sense of the bigger picture here, even though I'm speaking about the Northeast. There is a growing scholarly literature about Indian slavery in North America and also across the hemisphere. And if you are interested, there are now books on the library shelves that will take you more deeply into this. One of the points to stress, and I think that this lecture series, which is in so many ways keyed to 1619, presents some complications here, is that enslavement of Indigenous peoples in the Americas begins in 1492. It begins in Columbus's first voyage. In his very first letter, he writes, he's writing to the sovereigns back in Iberia, that as many slaves as they choose to send for, all heathens will be made available. So this is from his very first encounter with the Taino people. And indeed, Columbus sets in motion a violent, dispossessive, and often genocidal set of processes among Arawak communities and the greater Caribbean basin. This continues to develop intensely and violently in places like Potosi, a name of a mountain known for the silver riches, sometimes described in a Quechua word as meaning something like the mountain that eats men, giving us a vivid and horrifying impression of just how much this form of silver extraction was consuming Indigenous lives of Native people in that area who were pressured into doing this horrendous subterranean work to bring profit to the Spanish Empire through silver. But zipping up a little bit to the northeast, here I really want to credit the work that Wampanoag communities have been doing in recent years to put a spotlight not only on 1620, when the Pilgrims arrive, but the prehistory of English contact, and in particular the year 1614. There's a great new Wampanoag exhibition titled Captured 1614, which talks about the fact that 6 years prior to the arrival of the Pilgrims, in Massachusetts, the English Captain Thomas Hunt takes captive roughly 20 Native people from Cape Cod and surroundings. They are put on board a ship, they are brought to Europe, and the vast majority of them are never seen again. They are wrenched away from their Wampanoag kinship networks, and this instills a legacy of fear and anxiety among Wampanoag communities about what contact is going to mean. One of these captives who does return to his homeland around Patuxet is Tisquantum, also known as Squanto, who you may recall from Thanksgiving stories. He is one of these early people being trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean who manages to come back and then shape the events of the rest of the 17th century. This is a quite difficult image to look at, but when I research about New England history, this is an inescapable node about colonialism and Indigenous experiences. This is showing an attack by English troops and their Narragansett allies on a fort at Mystic. In the center, you can see in the middle of a palisade the homes of Pequot people, women, children, elders, who are seeking refuge in the middle of the Pequot War of the 1630s. They are attacked here by the English and Native allies, and many are killed on the spot. There are survivors, and this is also a place that winds up transporting Pequot people into slavery. Right, so very early in New England history, this is already becoming part of the social fabric of this region and the economy. One of the ways that we see this played out, and I do like to talk about documents because this is how we know certain aspects of these pasts, not everything, but certain of them. The Treaty of Hartford, signed in 1638, it's not really much of a deal for the Pequots. They are defined out of existence. Pequot survivors are sent as unfree people into the communities of both Mohegan and Narragansett, as well as into colonial households. We might ask some questions about how the experiences of Native people who are sent into fellow Native communities in unfree capacities might compare favorably or not with the experiences of Pequots sent into colonial households to do domestic and agricultural labor. One of the big findings that has come out of Pequot War scholarship relates to the fact that Pequots were very difficult to keep in bondage. They kept running away. They kept returning to their homelands, and this becomes a major source of debate among the English about whether it is feasible, not to mention just, to enslave Native peoples. My own research is much about the latter part of the 17th century and King Philip's War, the Indigenous resistance movement of the 1675 to 78. And we could spend all day talking about this, but in order to highlight a couple aspects through which this becomes influential in terms of freedom and unfreedom, I have a map here whose caption has been cut off, of the Piscataqua River region between Maine and New Hampshire. And I've marked two different places where small and also really large groups of Native people are seized by the English. They are captured. In this case, a woman and child, Narragansett, they are attempting to flee north to seek shelter among their Wabanaki relations up in the Northeast, up in the state of Maine today. And they are captured at Salmon Falls while they are running over a piece of timber that is across the river. We don't know what happens to them after this, but they are likely sent down to Boston, which has become one of these slave markets for Indigenous people during King Philip's War. And up on the right, near the present-day town of Dover, New Hampshire, hundreds of Native people taken into captivity due to the machinations of Richard Waldron, the English military commander up there. And those hundreds are sent down to Boston and are very difficult to track after this point. So much of the work in my book Memory Lands in the final section was tracking what I have called an Algonquian diaspora, meaning the forced removal of Native people from the Northeast. The English see this as a very strategic move. It makes it harder for there to be a second resistance movement, right? Because key community members have been literally sent out of their own homelands across an ocean to both North Africa, Tangier. Here is a document about that in the Public Record Office in England. 30 Native people who wind up in a galley ship in Tangier, who are not seen again, to our knowledge. And then other parts of the Atlantic world. I'm going to skip a couple of these, but one of these nodes that has raised a lot of interest, and I really want to give credit here, is the St. David's Island community in Bermuda, where there has been a lot of active community thinking and what has been described as reconnection with tribal communities in southern New England, who have long maintained stories in their communities that their ancestors were sent out of New England, possibly to Bermuda. This is a very powerful set of events that has been happening. It has a lot to say about complexities of identity in multiracial contexts. And it's also one that I think forces a reckoning with the limits of documents. So the example I wanted to share here is a probate inventory from Bermuda Archives. And I share this because it tells us about the limits of what colonists were interested in describing. This, very obviously, in the kitchen, it is treating both Native and African people, people of African descent, as property in the kitchen. This tells us a lot about English mentalities. Additionally, it does not tell us the communities from which these people came. We have names, but we don't know if they came from New England, if they came from Cherokee country, if they came from some other location. They are simply described as Indian. Or perhaps an even more cogent example, this one I spent a lot of time thinking about, a document in which an English writer in Bermuda is describing a woman there, an unfree woman, and he initially describes her as Indian and then crosses it out and writes Negro. He has no idea who she is. And this is some of the challenge of working with archives, which makes it all the more important to be in conversation with living communities and other forms of knowledge today. I think I have a couple more minutes, and so the last piece that I wanted to share as just a preview from my second book project relates to the president of Yale College, Ezra Stiles. He is often lauded as an abolitionist and given high acclaim for the anti-slavery stance he takes late in life. But as I have learned through my research, his story is much more complicated. And what I'm particularly interested in is recovering the life of Aaron Waukeet. He's a young Niantic boy who is indentured into Ezra Stiles' household in the 1780s. His mother, Ruth Waukeet, from the Niantic community, sends him to Stiles' home at Yale, and he's supposed to spend many years there. But for reasons we don't yet know, Ruth Waukeet comes and retrieves him within a year and brings him back home. And there he seems to depart from the paper trail. And so part of the work that I'm doing now is how to recover these lives in which there are often very fugitive or sort of passing traces of Native people entering into bondage, but then also going back home, and trying to reconnect this to a much larger or wider geography across the Native Northeast. And the final image I'll leave you to think with here is that Yale College, Ezra Stiles College, named after the colonist, has recently installed a plaque recognizing 3 young Native people, one Native person and 2 people of African descent who lived lives of unfreedom in relationship to Ezra Stiles. I think this offers a real provocation for institutions in terms of going forward. So, thank you.
Okay. Okay. I really enjoyed that. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A, and I will try not to take too much of your time. I'm really happy to be here today. It's a pleasure to share this stage with Christine DeLucia and also with one of my mentors, Catherine Allgor. I'm going to share a couple of things with you today. First, how I came to work at the intersection of Black and Native histories. Second, a piece of family history, my family history, on this subject in the U.S. South and West, drawn from my recent book. And then third, and only if there's time, I'll talk about all of this in the context of education and public history here in Boston. I'm starting with this quote, which I love, and then I'm going to show you a picture of my grandmother. And if by chance you were here about 1.5 years ago when I talked about my book, you might be bored for the first 2 minutes, but then I promise you won't after that. So this is a picture of my grandmother in Oklahoma in the 1920s, and her name was Odivia Brown at that time. A picture of my grandmother in the 1920s in Oklahoma, and her name was Odivia Brown. In New Jersey, our family was Black, while back home in rural Oklahoma, we were Creek Indian too. As a child of the 70s and 80s, I loved nothing more than listening to my grandmother's stories about growing up, both African American and Creek Indian in 1920s Oklahoma. In the long wake of the Newark riots, watching her plant tomatoes in the patch behind her house, I learned about a time when our family had owned hundreds of acres of land, she said, alongside our Indian and African descended kin. Grandpa Brown had a place they called Brownsville, where they built a school and a church. I learned, too, about the oil speculators who gradually came to see my great-grandfather. For the occasional lump sum, he worked as a Muskogee translator across Oklahoma, telling them, quote, just where to look for oil. Through my grandmother's stories, I learned about Indian and African-American land loss. In grade school, I memorized occasional facts about slavery and then about the Trail of Tears, but it was only through my grandmother that I learned about the intersection of the two, that some Native Americans had held slaves, that some African Americans had participated in the Indian land runs, and that the North American frontier was far more complicated than my textbooks had let on. During summers in Oklahoma, I began collecting evidence. My great-uncle Thurman would take us out to Brownsville, driving red dirt roads for hours, following the perfectly rectangular perimeter of the 1,000-acre home place. There was no longer a house there, but we found the steps to the school amidst a landscape of tall grass, Indian paintbrushes, and oil wells. One year at a YMCA summer camp back here in the Catskills, when I stumbled across a collection of Indian creation myths that seemed nearly identical to the Brer Rabbit folktales I'd heard occasionally from my father, I ran to a payphone to call him. Was Brer Rabbit Indian, Black, or both? I asked. These were the wrong questions, but at the time, back east, there was hardly language for what I wanted to know. There was, thankfully, the language of family. And when I moved away to college, my family's stories stayed with me, quietly highlighting the incompleteness of many other historical narratives. So long before I cared for history, per se, my grandmother's stories made me whole, pointing to things I sensed, but for which I had few words. The memoirist Ronnie Hartfield has written, our mother's stories have given us the maps by which our tribe locates its journeying, its streams and rivers, its stony places, its sometimes astonishing, more often incredibly affirming twists and turns. As a child of African American, Creek Indian, and Irish heritage, among others, in a sense, my grandmother's stories were origin stories, stories that helped me to make sense of who we were and who I was, stories that could travel with me from New Jersey to Oklahoma to France, South Africa, stories that taught me to understand and then to convey the diversity and complexity of our heritage, even and especially when that complexity was obscured or erased by the kinds of essentialist race thinking that dominated so much of the 20th century in the United States. Okay. So like most home places, this place called Brownsville that I mentioned was incredibly important to my family. Throughout my childhood, it loomed kind of larger than life, mostly through stories, because I grew up in New Jersey, not in Oklahoma, but then sometimes in Oklahoma in the summertime. Uncle Thurman's insistence on tracing the perimeter of it with the grandchildren in his car, going slowly around the entire perimeter and kind of noting how long it would take, right? Highlighting how long it took to get all the way around. The message was that we had all of this at one point, that we might not have much now, but that we did then. Unlike most home places, however, this one had belonged to the family for only a few short years, no more than a decade in the early 20th century. The oil companies that rushed in the 1910s bought up mineral rights and then offered lump sums, and eventually the land was mortgaged and then lost. To this day, the oil wells bob up and down where the house used to stand. My Uncle Thurman had spent part of his childhood out there in Brownsville and was raised by his grandfather, Thomas Jefferson Brown. Brown was the one ancestor I had the most stories about from this generation. And when I first started my book research, his was the first biography I set out to reconstruct. I don't and have never had a picture of him, but this is a picture of his son in Oklahoma. Now, while the majority of new settlers in post-emancipation Indian territory were identified as white, many were identified as black or mulatto. And later on, this becomes the story of the all-black town movement, towns like Boley and Clearview, in which you have kind of whole communities picking up, newly freed people picking up after Reconstruction from the U.S. South and moving into Indian territory prior to Oklahoma statehood. But in the case of Thomas Jefferson Brown, he migrated much earlier. So he'd been born in Arkansas in the 1850s. His father was an African-American man. His mother was said to be an Irish woman. And he was born in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And he then migrated into the territory on his own in the 1870s. This was my grandmother's grandfather I'm talking about here. And by migrating in the 1870s into the territory, he was kind of participating in a kind of single person migration as opposed to later kind of communal or family group migrations. A kind of quote unquote pioneering story. And once there, he married twice to African American descendants of the Creek and Seminole nations. Now I'm going to stop here and just explain what I mean when I say African American descendants or African descended members of the Creek Nation. When Brown married Aurelia Bruner, his first wife, she was the African Creek daughter of Tecumseh Bruner. And this was in the early 1870s. By marrying her, he married into a very long and rich history of the Bruner family within the Creek and Seminole nations, which included African-descended members of these nations who had migrated as part of Indian removal from the southeast. So hundreds of women and men, like those in Aurelia's family, were known as Estelusti, the Creek word used to refer to African-descended people of the Creek Nation. Many had lived among the Creeks in the southeast for centuries, sharing language, food, worldviews, and kinship ties. A real diversity of relationships coexisted in this context: adoption, captivity, intermarriage, much, much more. There was no single categorical pattern that defined kind of relationships between Creeks and Africans or African Americans at this time. But then in the early 19th century, as white settlers moved into Indian country in the southeast, the U.S. program of civilization, which I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A, actually encouraged the southeastern Indians, particularly the Creek, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, to adopt the agricultural practices of white American planters, including racial slavery, in the name of, quote, civilization and resisting the possibility of removal. It ended up being a small minority of wealthy Creeks and Cherokees, in this case, that participated, but nonetheless, many African-descended Creeks provided slave labor and contributed to the wealth of leading Creek families. When removal did come in the 1830s, for those who owned or had access to enslaved women and men, the harsh impact was somewhat blunted. So this is an image of Benjamin Hawkins, who was a U.S. federal official who worked in relationship to the Creek Nation, Creek Indians, and encouraged the adoption of various kinds of modern technologies of the time, including racialized slavery. In spite of that program, Indian removal eventually was forced, and these are the paths by which people migrated to Indian Territory, what's today the state of Oklahoma. And just to give you kind of context for the real interdependence between slavery and Indian removal, I wanted to show you a couple other maps. This is a map of cotton production in 1820 prior to Indian removal. For each dot is 2,000 cotton bales. And then Indian removal happens in the 1830, in large part because of the pressure of incoming white settlers who are looking to claim this land and to plant on this land and to bring with them enslaved labor, especially enslaved African labor at this point. By 1850, this is a map of cotton production. And by this point, the Creek, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, for the most part, with some notable exceptions, are in Indian territory, what was become Oklahoma. And then, of course, by 1860, we see the Civil War. So that kind of forced removal and displacement of Southeastern Native peoples westward, right, makes possible the opening of these lands, not simply for cotton, but specifically for a domestic slave trade that then replaces these populations with enslaved African American labor from the eastern seaboard, especially Virginia and the Carolinas. So one man who experienced Indian removal as the property of a Creek family was Aurelia Bruner's cousin, Para Bruner, pictured here. A Creek man named Joe Bruner recalled that the first time he met Para was in 1898, until which time he had known, he said, very little of my father's people. I was a member of the House of Kings in Okmulgee, and there I met an old ex-slave named Para. He was a member from one of the 3 Negro towns of the Creek Nation. When he heard my name called, he came over and told me that he had been my grandfather's slave and had come to this country with him. Para said my grandfather's name was George and that they had been landed people in Alabama, unquote. Para played a prominent role within the Creek Nation and among Afro-descended Creeks after the Civil War. He served in the 1870s as town chief of one of the Black Indian towns in Oklahoma, in Indian Territory. And Thomas Jefferson Brown's children referred to Para as Uncle Para Bruner. He was, in fact, a close relative of Aurelia's. But by the time Para shared this bit of family history in 1898, much had changed for the Estelesi, increasingly referred to as colored or Negro citizens of the Creek Nation, just as it had for Joe, his fellow Creeks, and Indians across the territory, whose land was now again under vast pressure from incoming white settlers, land, and oil speculators. While a post-war treaty of 1866 had forced these nations to adopt their former slaves as part of the nations with equal rights, by this time, American politicians and reformers alike increasingly viewed this multiracial region as a threat to civilization and Indian progress. In the 1890s, responding to land-hungry settlers, the federal government ultimately coerced compliance with the Dawes Allotment Act, by which they claimed all collectively held Indian lands and oversaw the Dawes Commission's assignment of individual allotments. Acre by acre, the Dawes Act depleted the American Indian land base, forced American Indians into capitalist land markets, and imposed patrilineal nuclear households in place of long-standing matrilineal societies. Now, one of the most glaring flaws in this deeply problematic allotment process in Indian Territory lay in the Commission's emphasis on blood quantum and the distinction drawn or made between Creeks and freed people of the Creek Nation, so former slaves of the Creek Nation, who made up as many as 1/3 of the Creek population. Determining quantum of blood for purposes of allotting land or for any other purposes was hardly straightforward. A Creek man named Silas Jefferson testified in 1895 when asked whether he knew any former slaves who were also descendants of Indians. I have seen many a one. Jefferson testified further that in Creek country it was impossible to tell whether someone was Indian or black or white by appearances. And yet property restrictions and eligibility for benefits were made contingent upon this very percentage. So whether which tent you went to, and the Dawes Commission, here's a picture of a porch, but they also had these tents where you'd go to one tent if you were deemed to be a Creek freedman, and you'd go to another tent if you were deemed to be Creek by blood. And very often the officials would stand there and just send you to the one or the other, depending on how they thought you appeared, right? This has to do with color, of course. It also has to do with dress, comportment, language, all sorts of very malleable factors. And depending on that seemingly kind of flippant moment, right, that would determine whether and how much land one received, whether that land was protected from speculators coming in by various legal provisions and so forth, whether it was taxed, and therefore whether you might hold on to it for any length of time. Okay, so while blood had mattered to privileges within the nation prior to this, blood identities were now officially sanctioned by the US federal government. Full blood status was now linked to the dominant racial categories of an expanding US empire. So what you have here is kind of, on the one hand, you have this vast wave of incoming white settlers and some black settlers as well. You also have the appropriation of collectively held Indian land by the US federal government again. And then you have this kind of propping up of blood and sanctioning of American racial categories in what's about to become the state of Oklahoma. So not surprisingly, it becomes a Jim Crow state, even though this was the state to which many, or the territory to which many people were trying to escape the emergence of Jim Crow in, say, Mississippi and Alabama. And as I said, the size of the land allotments that followed and the degree to which they were protected was determined by whether one was categorized as, quote, Creek by blood or Creek freedman. Now, in the case of my family, in the case of Thomas Jefferson Brown, his first wife, Aurelia, was designated freedman, and the second wife, who was Aurelia's niece, so this is all within the same family, was designated by blood, even though, again, they have the same ancestors. His children by his second wife, therefore, received 160 acres land each, and you can see them all on here. And on that land, their quote-unquote white-looking father, that's how his grandchildren described him, was able to secure more than 1,000 acres of land, a school, a church, and a post office, a Black and Creek settlement in the territory known as Brownsville. Yet his children from his marriage to Aurelia did not. Against this backdrop, Brown's children and grandchildren were taught again and again about their roots, namely their Creek family history. And I won't read all of this, but this is a letter, one of the only paper documents that I had in the course of my research coming directly out of the family. Mostly I had kind of turns of phrases or pieces of stories, but this was one of two letters that I actually had from 1901, I believe. And it's a letter from Cheney Wallace, who was Thomas Jefferson Brown's daughter from that first marriage, writing to her sister saying, you know, what you need to do. I want you to tell you to go and file right away, and when you go, you must call for Really Bruner, and you must tell them about your grandfather name and uncles and aunt name that is on the dun roll, and they will ask you about your sister and your brother. And you must tell them, and you must tell the age of them. So you must tell them that I am 28 years old, that you are about 25 or 26, Fred is about 21 or 22, and you must tell them Sile is about 18 or 19, and you must tell them that Lemmy is 16 or 17. Lemmy was Thurman's father. And Thurman kept this letter in this little leather folder that he kept. Don't make no mistake in your talking, and you must tell them about my children ages and that Washington is 7, and it goes on from there. And so you get from this letter the kind of urgency and the specificity with which people were trying to substantiate their claims to land that was always meant to be collectively held and meant to belong, and yet by this point was in great peril. A picture of Thomas Jefferson Brown's son, Charles, who was on the horse. He ends up marrying Lorinda Coleman. And then a picture of my grandmother and her siblings later on. Ultimately, the land is lost. And after this, Brownsville was largely remembered by 20th century descendants as Thomas Jefferson Brown's land, not Julia Simon's or Aurelia Bruner's. And as a black settlement, not an Indian or a black Indian one. And this is partly because Brown appeared in most recollections as the patriarch of the family and many other reasons. But as I've shown, it's also because of much broader changes that were afoot in the territory and in the country at this time. Most importantly, the kind of importation of US racial categories into the territory. At the age of 96, Thurman Brown was one descendant who remembered it, having grown up there, remembered it the way it actually was. While examining an allotment map of the area, I said to him, this would have been Grandpa Brown's land. He looked up from the map and said, you mean Grandma Brown's. Grandpa Brown didn't have no land. Having witnessed the first century of Oklahoma statehood, Thurman knew better than most the historical relationship between land and identity. Willfully tying the land to his black Indian grandmother, Julia Simon, Thurman highlighted the origins of this land as a 19th century Creek allotment at a time before widespread settlement of the territory and the rise of Jim Crow, when African Americans could still be Creek. I want to show you just, I promise 10 seconds, just the beginning of this film clip, which shows my grandmother going back to this site after 80 years. She's going back to Brownsville in 2007. And about 60 other relatives. We climbed up there. It's on oil land. We climbed through barbed wire.
Because you have that.
She's 85 at the time. Others are in their 70s climbing through this barbed wire with kids. And then we got up there to the cemetery. And
Gone to a better land, and they were all about.
and people, we found this, this is on oil land, but the gravestones are still there, and just incredibly kind of powerful kind of return that happens on a somewhat regular basis now. Every kind of 7 to 10 years, we all go back and kind of memorialize this place. Thank you.
No one knew that was your first time back.
Well, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to talk about, and actually, for this little part, I'd like to pick up where you kind of tantalizingly presented us with the idea of your own work, the two of you, in public history. So public history is a fairly new term, and I'm going to give it my definition, and feel free to adjust it. But pretty much it's any kind of dealing with the past, any kind of historical work other than professional academic work. So it's museums and libraries and monuments and the History Channel and popular history, movies, anything to do with history other than the academy. And so while we have with us now very respected academic historians with their books, these two professionals also have a rather active public history life, and I wondered if you wanted to talk to it. Christine, do you want to start?
I have been struck by how vanishingly few monuments or memorials there are that acknowledge Indigenous slavery in New England. I might be able to count them on one hand, but maybe not. And part of that is a lack of knowledge in this region about what has happened, and part of it is a real resistance to marking that in public space. What if, just to think aloud here, what if Boston acknowledged in a formal public-facing way its history as a slave trading port involving Native people, right? Where are the prisoners from King Philip's War being sent out of, some of them from here? I was thinking also of the documentary you may know called Traces of the Trade, which came out a couple of years ago about the DeWolf family in Bristol, Rhode Island, going back into their own family tree and learning that the DeWolfs were the largest slave traders in all of North America at some point. And they traced that back to West Africa. This is a white family today. I was shocked that that film did not engage the fact that Bristol, Rhode Island is located in Paukenawket homelands. It's actually King Philip's own land.
Wow.
And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity, as we were chatting a little bit about, for better connecting Native African-American histories within a larger context of settler colonialism so that they are not treated as totally separate things. But so little of this is visible right now.
Well, I would not be a good president of the MHS if I didn't throw this into the mix too, and ask you to both of you reflect on how can a place like the Massachusetts Historical Society, what else can we do? We collect certain things, we have fellowships, we have prizes, we have panels like this, but what else can places like this do to examine the very issues you're talking about?
Yeah, I think, I really echo Christine's point on this, and I think the contrast is particularly striking. And in my own work, I kind of come up against this in interesting ways. So I direct this African American Trail project in which we've mapped, my colleague Kara Greenidge and I have mapped 235 sites, I believe, across Massachusetts related to kind of the African diaspora over the last 4 centuries. And we have gone out of our way to kind of talk about African diaspora, African descended, and Afro-Native sites. But even when we first did that kind of initial drafting, I mean, it was well-intentioned project. There was no one saying, oh, you're obscuring or erasing, Native lands and places by creating yet another new map. But it was on my mind, like, how are we gonna do this in a way that feels right? And so, I don't have a good answer for exactly, but we did work with, I have a graduate student at Harvard who happens herself to be Afro-Wampanoag, and she's actually going to be speaking here in January about her dissertation research, Mary McNeil. But so she and I worked on kind of really amping up a bit the Afro-Native part of the story, but it was really striking to me that how easy it is to kind of be complicit in this kind of further erasure of Native sites there. And the other thing I was going to say is, I think part of the reason it's so difficult is because of how the history played out itself, right? So kind of classic kind of divide and conquer strategies in which, say, in the U.S. South, the U.S. government actively tried to separate Native peoples from African-descended peoples when they noticed that there was this, vast multiracial terrain, multinational terrain, and therefore possibility of multiracial, multinational resistance. And so partly because of those specific efforts at dividing communities and political, for political and economic reasons, the histories themselves have been compartmentalized and then many of them erased.
Yeah. I bring up the topic of public history, too, because I think it's interesting to all of us. I mean, you wouldn't be here if you weren't interested in history, and we experience it, in all these different ways. I also wanted to bring up this idea of what kind of history you're doing. So we're still calling this the new history, even though it's decades old, because you are studying peoples that are unrepresentative in the mainstream narrative of political power. So we still call it the new history. But what's interesting is also hearkening to a very old form of history, which family history, and a lot of us here are interested in family history. Can you talk a little bit about how family history, as we've seen here, literally your family, but also your really interesting contention that the families are the keepers of the histories and the disseminators of history. How did this field of family history suddenly become really cutting edge?
So my own family history is not from either of these contexts that I'm talking about, the Italian-American, right? And one point of interest for me has been revisiting my own family's lack of knowledge about, say, Narragansett homelands, having grown up there and just seemingly complete no knowledge. But more important, I really want to highlight the work of tribal genealogists who have done extraordinary, just mind-boggling amounts of family research, in part for federal recognition petitions. So the requirement by the US federal government to prove the existence of a Native nation, problematic in 100 ways, but one of the requirements is to document family continuity and leadership over time in a particular place. And so genealogists within Nipmuc, Wampanoag, name your community here, they have done thousands of pages of research. And that has allowed them to make connections with some of these colonial documents when, say, an individual's name might appear, and if you're not familiar with those kinship networks, that's not going to ring any bells. But when you are, it then activates this whole other understanding. And so I mention that because federal recognition is a very contentious process. It is US state-driven, but it has also been a place where new kinds of family-based genealogy have come together.
I would say, the book project I'm working on now is kind of a long history of African American genealogy from the Middle Passage to the present. So it's specifically about kind of familial genealogy practices as well as collecting and archiving that happen kind of behind closed doors. And it's not so much about trying to collect all that material into one place, but instead to kind of notice the patterns. So what happened in the course of writing about my own family as a piece of historical scholarship is that I became less interested in kind of the veracity of the stories I was hearing, because of course most of them were inaccurate in a million ways, or kind of, covering up some other secret that people didn't want to talk about, as I'm sure you all are familiar.
We all have families. Yes.
But I became more interested in why certain stories were told over and over and over again, and why others were kind of buried or never became stories in the first place. And in the context of African American and the history of the diaspora, for me that's involved, for instance, memories of slavery in the post-emancipation period. In the 1870s, I find over and over again a kind of real silence and a distancing of family members or family kind of identity from histories of enslavement. So people attempting to claim antebellum freedom, my father was free, or to claim my grandfather or my grandmother more often was Creek or Cherokee, or was white. All of that really changes by the turn of the 20th century, and then you have this kind of the roots of what becomes the New Negro movement and the Harlem Renaissance, and a kind of opening up of kind of pridefulness around survival. And so I'm looking at patterns in storytelling, specifically in the African American and diasporic context, but of course that does to some extent include what is our relationship to Native peoples, even when we are ourselves Native, but are rejected from the nation in some cases.
The other thing is, I was watching an amazing documentary the other day about a Truth and Reconciliation committee that's taking place in the state of Maine regarding the U.S. government taking of Native children, particularly in Maine, but also in different parts of the country. And a way of dealing with that is to have this Truth of Reconciliation Committee. And I started extrapolating that on a larger context and thinking, is this a way, one of the ways that we can deal with history and the history of enslaved people and Indigenous people? So I was hoping for your thoughts about that, both what is happening there and also, is this something, is this a way of tackling horrible issues?
So the movie I think that you're mentioning is Dawnland, which just won an Emmy. I would highly recommend, about the removal of Wabanaki children from their communities and the consequences of that. I was thinking, actually, as you were saying that one of the most disturbing features of the enslavement of Native people in the 17th, 18th centuries is the deliberate targeting of children, the desire to, on the part of colonial authorities, to take children away from their families, to acculturate them to English lifeways, to Christianity, to separate them from their kinship groups. And that is a very intentional strategy. It is diminishing communities' abilities to regroup and be resilient, and it's also disconnecting the next generation from the land. And we both could talk about land for a long time, but that is at the core of a lot of these systems of imposed bondage. On the note of truth and reconciliation, the way I would describe this is to be thinking very carefully about who the desire for reconciliation is coming from, that there have been some cases in New England where it is emerging from a non-Native community to have a reconciliation, which seems quite premature, that actually there's a very long process and set of relationships that needs to happen before arriving at any point like that. And so resisting the urge to sort of rush for closure.
We have another question.
Hi, my name is Gloria Brown Marshall, and I'm in New York. I wrote a book, Race, Law, and American Society, 1607 to present, that looks at the role of law in the oppression of people and how it's used in more recent history and attempts to fight against that oppression. And when I look at Native American and African American experiences, I wonder, in this sense of nationalism, when you talk about to adopt civilization by becoming slaveholders, was there an attempt under law in a way to bring the Native American into what was considered white, to maintain this sense of whiteness, and as has been done with other groups like the Irish and the Italians and others? And was that a failed attempt by making the African American the point from which they would judge, whiteness? And so when I think about, because I think about our Native American, African American experience today, and I understand that we're not together the way we should be as people of color. And so was that something from the 1800s and the early 1900s that was intentional to maintain that division? And how is it, do you see it, has it played out successfully from their point of view? Because we don't have that connection today.
I can say something about that. I'll just be really brief. I won't speak to prior to the 19th century, but really when we get to the 20th century and Oklahoma is about to become a state, it becomes a state on the promise to many of the folks involved, the white folks involved, that it will adopt Jim Crow laws almost verbatim, copying from Mississippi. And in that framework, there is advocacy among the Cherokee in particular to, if there's going to be a Jim Crow system, to be on the white side of that system. And so for purposes of school segregation, for instance, Cherokee are considered white at that moment, from that moment on. Of course, it's more complicated than that in terms of how people actually identified and live their lives, but there is a kind of imposing of a black-white binary onto a really complex state. So I agree with the sentiment.
A brief thought on this. In the context of Rhode Island, there are efforts by the state of Rhode Island to redefine Narragansett people as, using the racialized language of the time, colored, black, other categories. And this is part of a deliberate state attempt to undermine Native sovereignty, right? Because identified as sovereign Native communities, the land is there. and a different kind of political status is there by attempting to redefine in these other ways what has been described by some tribal historians as paper genocide, right? Writing people out of existence as Native people. This is part of a much, multi-pronged strategy to diminish sovereignty and the land base, and has all kinds of repercussions in the present.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, yes, my first question, will you come again? And second question is this problem of it being so rough in terms of the understanding of that historic connection, how widespread is that? And then I also just wonder what you think about Philbrick's treatment of the Mayflower, where he talks a lot about the early connections between the Puritans and the settlers
Who would
and
like
the
to take
native
that?
peoples
Sure.
here.
Answer that part.
Yeah.
So,
A very
for both of you.
brief answer, and also to point people to a document that is in the MHS collections related to the ship Seaflower. People know about the Mayflower, but not as much about the Seaflower that Nathaniel Philbrick writes about. This is the ship onto which more than 100 Native people are sent as slaves at the end of King Philip's War, right? So to kind of bookend in a certain way 1620, 1676, and they are sent out from New England to points that are not yet known. Some of the issues I have with that framing is when the story then ends there, it gives a sense of utter dissipation, loss, when in so many ways the important piece is how communities have continued and remained resilient and refashioned connections amid those tremendous upheavals. And so in my own work, the story never ends in the 17th century. It always carries right through today.
And just briefly, Professor Johnson, I really appreciate your question and your comment and the research that you've done on some of these dynamics in Kansas. And I just wanted to, I guess the one thing I'll say about the erasure or the lack of knowing or the roughness, as you put it, is, I mean, the law and the policy was really powerful. And in the case of Oklahoma, there were families in which part of the family became white and part of the family, or remained Indian, and part of the family became black, and disowned one another. I mean, mostly from one side to the other, but literally would not acknowledge that they were at once part of the same family because the incentives were so great. I mean, the material consequences were so tremendous in the Jim Crow era in Oklahoma. And one of the ways I talk about this, in my, when I say that I do family history, I sometimes say among academics, okay, it sounds really romantic, but I think maybe I'm a Marxist family historian in the sense that, what I'm interested in is how stories have value and real material value. I mean, if a grandmother tells a grandchild, this is who you are and these are our family stories, there is a reason she's imparting that knowledge. And it's not for fun or for leisure or for laughs or something like that, right? It's no small thing. It's because she thinks that child is going to be better off and have better life outcomes if she gets this version of their past.
That's great. This will be the last two questions.
So my question is for Kendra, because you said at the end that you were interested in sort of these patterns of these challenges with family histories. And as somebody who's Mexican American from the Southwest, whose family history, there's a lot of erasure of the connection to the indigenous heritage. So, it's an old joke to be an old Indian, but there's not seemingly the knowledge of connection that maybe you and your family had created. So I was wondering if you could speak to both those challenges of the silences and the erasure. I mean, I know this from my own family and as a legal scholar, a race scholar of law, how that might be connected to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and whiteness in the United States context and white supremacy. But, to what extent are your patterns also looking at other groups outside of the Northeast, Southeast, which is hugely
Southwest, too. Yeah.
Well, yes, whether it includes the Southwest and the Northwest that had very different histories and different colonization experiences, and its relation to these family histories.
Not at all aiming to be or claiming to be comprehensive in this new project, but instead, I would say I'm looking at the African diaspora within North America for the most part. So beginning with new arrivals via the Middle Passage and then going through the present to some degree. And so North America is my kind of landscape, but obviously, the U.S. more particularly, as it develops, is part of that. The one other thing I'll add is that kind of shame and pride, I often say, are the two emotions that I work with the most. So shame, the things that, which usually causes us not to tell something, and then pride, the things we feel, excited to tell. Yeah.
Last question.
Hello, my name is Delaney Sieber. I'm a graduate student of history at Simmons University. So I'm particularly interested in the Native experience as I'm researching, doing historiography on it right now. What really caught my attention, though, was how you were saying this is a very continuous study that we were doing. This isn't just some new history that's coming out of the blue. Do you feel that this is stemming, this upsurge in Native slavery history is coming from those family documents then? Just looking at what resources are available to us, say, in the 1920s and 30s versus, resources that are starting to pop up in the 80s and the 90s and so on.
It's really exciting to be thinking about the ways that digitization has made some resources become more visible and accessible. And the example that I'll share is the Yale Indian Papers Project, which is currently going through some major challenges of continued existence. But it has done tremendous work in collaboration with tribal communities to be not only scanning and digitizing, but transcribing handwritten documents that have been very far-flung through the Northeast and also Europe about Native experiences, including indentured servitude, slavery, and emancipation, right? And this has made searching for these documents, locating them, so much more possible than it had been when these were sitting in often very far-flung places with no keywords or no family names to search for. And I want to stress that this was being done in close collaboration with tribal communities in response to some of their own research interests. And if the project, fingers crossed, gets continued support, I know that one of the ambitions is to be working with tribal collections too, and thinking about some ways of partnering to bring forward these documents that previously have not been seen by historians and thus have been treated as if they don't exist, right? So there's a real restoration happening through new media.
And I just wanted to, I don't have a response to this, but I wanted to say one more thing about the last person's question, which it skipped my mind for the moment. But there was a chapter in my dissertation that didn't make it into my book that actually was about a family that leaves Oklahoma. The father feels like he's on the run from having shot back at white night riders in Mississippi, gets to Oklahoma, hops around from town to town with his 8 or 9 children and his wife, and eventually is, convinced he's on the run, and they head to northern Mexico. And so they head specifically to San Luis Potosi, and he ends up staying with one of his sons. The wife decides she doesn't like it, wants to go back to Oklahoma with other kids. But I wrote basically a piece about this family in which one side of the family ends up marrying into a Mexican family, and then 60 years pass, and they have a reunion in the 1970s for the first time, and they can't speak to each other without a translator, but they have someone translating. But one branch essentially has started I think a sugar plantation kind of in northern Mexico, and the rest is in Oklahoma, living as black, and they reunite, and since then they've been going about every 15 years to get together again.
Oh, well, you've given us a great afternoon. Thank you so much. Thank you again, and thank you all for coming.